Hey, what's up? Just want to talk about the flat earth or lack thereof. Meaning, anyway, I'm going to about to be biased here and say that the earth is in fact more likely leaning towards a much more spherical shape than it is a disc-like shape. And please hear me out. I don't think anybody's stupid for believing or being curious or undecided that the earth might be flat, because in doing this research, I didn't do completely thorough research, but I gave it a good once or twice over. And I always think research could be done better, and I plan to do this even better and more thoroughly in the future. However, that being said, a lot of the people, when I started digging in, especially through YouTube videos, to arguments for and against the flat earth, I was finding that a lot of the people that are believing in a flat earth are into science. They back their decision by science. And of course, science can mean anything. You do an experiment and you try and, you come up with some hypothesis, right? The scientific method, you do an experiment, and if everything seems to line up or not line up, whatever, you make your decisions based on that, right? So a lot of the people, and this is like a paradox where it's easy to argue it either way, especially if you just leave out a few select facts. But if one does include a few, and these are simple select facts that I'm talking about. They're not like, you don't need NASA, you don't need any of that stuff to prove or disprove a spherical or flat earth, I feel like. So using just simple science, if you even want to call it that, not quote unquote science, just simple observable scientific method science that you can consistently perform an experiment and consistently get the same result. Of course, all science at best is a theory, which is just something waiting to be disproven or improved upon, expanded upon, supplanted with something else, whatever, right? So, all that being said, that's where I am at with this. This is just my little like rough draft of a junior high science project, or I guess you call it middle school these days. So I'm going to recite off of a list a few things. I just watched a video of like, that seems to be available by 100 different people, is like 75 Bible verses that prove a flat earth supposedly. And of course there's videos that have hundreds of verses, they claim. There's videos with probably less, but the 75 one's pretty popular. And even then it was really like stretching a lot of the Bible verses that it was even using. But there were some, of course, where I could see where people might think whatever. They could, especially with somebody dictating it in a very biased form and not admitting to their biasness like I am right now. They're just sort of like, it's just stupid. But they set up these little experiments, but they leave off the key points or whatever. That being said, the Bible is about mindset. It's not about concept. Well, how can I say that? It all matters with the Hebrew mindset. That's what the Bible's written from, for the most part, 99% of the time. So that being said, sorry I keep saying that being said. I'm just going to rattle these off and get this over with. So they talk about the circle of the earth as one of the arguments, and they say, oh, if it's the circle of the earth, that couldn't be a sphere. They'd say like the ball earth or whatever. Well, biblically speaking, if you use like Strong's concordance and Hebrew and Greek dictionaries, then you can easily find out that when they talk about circle, oftentimes it can also mean ball, like ball and circle are interchangeable. And that, along with that, they're also talking about, a lot of times with Hebrew, you have to think about the verb and not necessarily like the noun or the concept. And the concept comes from the action, from the verb. So oftentimes when they say circle, they mean moving in a circle or a circuit. And the same thing when they say ball, it could mean spinning or rotating like a ball. So knowing that, when the circle of the earth could just as easily mean the circuit of the earth, the rotation of the earth, things like that. And it says in the Bible that the earth will be, when you start really digging into the context of things, I think I have a little bit here on the screen I'm about to show in a minute to do with this. It relates the circle being in its place, right? So by that doesn't mean that it's perfectly motionless, even if an English translation might translate it like that. It means that it's like spinning, like, just like a top. If you spin a top, it stays there. It kind of moves around, maybe in a circle or whatever, but it stays there in its place for the most part. And that, in all honesty, to the best of my knowledge, that is the more heavy way to describe this circle of the earth. Or you can just think of circle as the earth as a literal circle and just the encirclement of the earth, which does not matter if it's disc shape or spherical shape for that to apply. Hell, Sheol in Hebrew, it's not Hades. Hades was basically the god of the underworld in Greek religion that was blurred over into so-called Christianity once that became more involved with the state and things like that, and the whole just Greco-tizing too much of the Bible. But anyway, hell is Sheol, which just means grave or pit, literally. There's not this place of eternal torment. You might see some translations sort of like work it that way or whatever. That I would encourage you, look it up for yourself, especially using something like Strong's, and really dig in on that, and you'll see that most likely it's not the way it seems. It's everlasting or continual banishment to the grave, to death. It's eternal death, because that's what the Bible seems to speak, is that you either are, everybody gets resurrected, and then they're either going to face a second death and the eternal death, the eternal grave, or they're going to basically most likely end up on the rejuvenated earth, except for a few select that will actually end up in heaven. Not everybody goes to heaven, and people, according to the biblical narrative, do not go to heaven right when they die. They go to hell, the grave, not like Hades kind of hell, not underworld. They go to the grave pit, death, conscious of nothing, which the Bible also aligns with that same narrative. So all the atheists that think like, they're not going to go anywhere after they die, that also coincides with the biblical narrative. But you also are incapable of telling time when you're dead too, so it could feel like an instant between death and being resurrected again. So back to more of the flat geostationary Earth arguments. One of the things is the Hebrew word move, or mot, I believe it might be pronounced. Who knows how the ancient Hebrew was really pronounced? But there are Bible verses that say like the earth shall not be moved, or the world shall not be moved, things like that. That's how it's translated into English. If you do look up that word, that moved could just as easily, if not more likely, mean to slip, fall, or waver, especially fall. So the earth shall not fall is probably, like I said, I do have some bias, but that seems to be more of the sense that the term's used in. If you want to think of it literally, in Job it says the earth, which I have that verse open right here, it says, he stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. So the earth hangs upon nothing in space, effectively, right? This is considered by many scholars to be the oldest book of the Bible right here. From BC times, says the earth hangs upon nothing. Hangs, mind you, can also mean sits upon. So the earth sits upon and hangs upon nothing. I'll show you another verse that backs that up in just a second. I'm about halfway down going through these words here I've written down on this piece of paper. And so the earth as far as moving, like I said, it could most likely mean fall. So you could think of it won't fall through space necessarily, but that fall term can also mean to waver, so you could think of it, start thinking of it in more of a conceptual sense of like the world shall not waver, things like that. I'll leave that up to you. When you see terms like pillars, right down here, you can see this is starting to go into another verse, the pillars of heaven, which that right there tells you the way that heaven's described as the expanse and space, things like that. It is obviously not upon pillars. Some people might not see that right off the bat. I don't blame them. But pillars are used, when they're used in that sense in the Bible of earth and heaven, completely figuratively. They're not literal pillars. They're talking about the foundation usually shaking, things like that. So that was a common Hebrew idiom, was to describe if you thought of something like a table and the legs of the table as pillars, and then you shake the table upon its pillars, So it's just like if a person says, "Don't ruffle my feathers." They're not literally saying they have feathers, I would think, with most people, right? So they're they're using a figure, something figurative that you can think like, oh, if you ruffle a chicken's feathers, it's going to get upset, right? So that person's telling you, don't make me upset. It's just an idiom that happens to be an English one, right? These are Hebrew ones. The pillars are a Hebrew idiom. Don't believe anything I say, look it up for yourself. Then we get to like verses where it says like the heavens were bowed, and a lot of the flat earth argument will argue that, if you bow something like a rainbow or whatever, then you picture that arch, and that's the dome over the flat earth and things like that. Well, if you actually look up the natah, the Hebrew word under bowed, it means to stretch, spread, or bend away. And they often just say to bend, but it actually, that word, one of the more seemingly heavy definitions, is to bend away, to spread, to stretch. These are all things that aren't, to bow like a rainbow is sort of like to bring in, to gather together, right? But this term seems to most often mean stretch, spread, bend away. I could be wrong on some of this stuff, but I really don't feel like I am. I feel like I'm probably leaning towards the more correct context and definitions, but there are little one-off scenarios where things could go the other way. The firmament means the expanse or the visible arc of the sky. That's just the generic Strong's definition. I really need to continue studying the way that Hebrew words are put together, especially the ancient Hebrew words, so that I'd like to go over this again one more time at least in the future, and really break down what these words are composed of. Because if you take the actual each Hebrew letter, those were tainted during the Babylonian captivity era, and they became the Chaldean square script for the most part, which is that weird so-called modern Hebrew that you see a lot. It's really just a specific style of like Aramaic, what became known as Aramaic, which was based on that Chaldean corruption. If you go back to the truly ancient Hebrew, it's very glyphic. It's much more like leaning towards a hieroglyph than it is towards, some type of just random script. And with that being said, each character, each glyph has a meaning. So, and then when you get to things like winds, one of the arguments is the four winds. It's the four winds of heaven. So that most often, if you see like the four winds talking about, and that seems to mean, to the best of my being able to define it so far, is the scattering or coming together of people. So when you hear about the four winds, and also if you think about like how in Western civilization we use things like northeast, southwest, or southwest, things like that, those directions, the four winds individually can sort of mean that. But that's I don't want to make that point too strongly, because if you look up like west, east, those terms in Strong's, you'll see that like in Greek, which would be New Testament's Greek, Old Testament's Hebrew, for the 99.99% of it. Um, so in Greek, west means sunset. That it literally that's the direction of the sunset, right? And like I was saying, how they'll use these more different terms to describe it, these terms that you can relate to in your culture, and then you're able to go, okay, in that direction, in the direction of the sunset. So that's how they would say west in the New Testament times. But in the Hebrew times, often they would use the word for the sea, or the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, which from like an Israeli perspective, that the nation of Israel perspective, that would be to the west, right? And then in the Hebrew perspective for east, because east comes from it's a pagan goddess that actually the term east is derived from. So they didn't use that back then. What they used was the terms past, or a term for past or front, because if you think like during the day the sun rises and it's in the past, or where it started in the front, that's the direction of the so-called east. And then in Greek, east literally means rising of light, the dawn. It literally, just like how it means sunset for west, that's literally where they adapted that to. North just means wind, and that's supposedly in Greek, in the Bible, and that is because the winds from the north would come in during the afternoon and cool the threshing floors and bring more moist air. It was just like a cooling wind, obviously, from the north, right? So they would just say the wind for that. And then south, there doesn't seem to be even a word for. It's just like if you look in the Strongs, it's just the, and then it like, I don't know. I think Strong's is lacking there maybe, but something to do with the translation might be lacking. But I can't find any designated word, at least in the Greek, for that. I forgot to look that one up in Hebrew. Southwest, though, is the to pour rain. So that's how they would say that. So it was the direction that the pouring rain came from, was the southwest. Okay, so I think I've covered most of it. So we're just going forward, remembering that the literal interpretation is usually not the way to go, especially when you get into this heavily idiomatic stuff. It's all, for the most part, figurative. It's based on what you first think literally, right? You initially should have that literal thought seated, but then don't hang on to that. Think of like the ruffling the feathers thing, like, yeah, you should think of a chicken ruffling its feathers, but then you should let go of the fact that a human has feathers. And when you see things like the sun stood still, that is another thing. Like when you see Bible verses like that, they'll often say it's from the Hebrew mindset, it's from what you witness with your eyes. You don't witness the earth standing still. The earth always feels like it's standing still. So even to this day, we talk about the sun rising and setting, even though a lot of us are pretty comfortable with the idea of a round earth rotating and all that type of thing. And we know that it's really heavily based on the Earth's rotation, that so-called movement of the sun. But today it's still just way easier just to say, the sun rose and the sun's moving across the sky and the sun's setting, right? So we got to cut the Hebrews the same slack there, that it was probably a lot easier for them to say that. And then the last thing on my little scratch notes here is that second to last thing is that the Bible code software, there's an argument that a lot of the flat earthers will make. If you feed the software, the biblical text into this Bible decoding software, it will come up with these terms that, you can make like a crossword puzzle that says basically flat earth and, supposedly other terms. I didn't even see those demonstrated. And I really feel like, there's a an old saying that if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. And especially when you're given a text as heavy as the Bible, if you really get crazy, you can pull out a lot of stuff from it that is just beyond what it should be. And I've seen it done to where it's impressive. It seems like, wow, this is saying that whatever, there's all this prophetic stuff written between the lines. But that being said, there is stuff written between the lines in the Bible, but you can decipher that yourself using simple stuff like equidistant letters, where you can go like 7 times 7. Like seven's a big number of perfection in the Bible. So doing things based on sevens seems to be more legit, and not feeding it into Bible software that's just going to sit there and spin the data until some random occurrence happens. It will, you can actually go into the Old Testament and do, I believe it, if I remember correctly, is 7 times 7 is 49. And so you go 49 letters. And depending on your Hebrew text you're using, there might be little nuns and stuff used for ands that were like added. So some of those you might have to actually like not count, which is just kind of like almost like an apostrophe or something, or a conjunction versus a non-conjunction or something. It's not a huge deal. It's not like you're taking out words of real substance. They were more implied in the original text, and then later, kind of like in the King James, they'll add the italicized words even though they might have been implied, and they're like, oh, we're just going to go ahead and throw in the here even though it's not necessary. So there were some things, just a few little, insignificant additions to the Hebrew text. And this is how you verify that your text is, very close, if not exactly the same as maybe the oldest Hebrew text, because by going through every 49 characters, you should be able to spell, starting with Genesis, Torah, and in Exodus, you spell Torah, and then what is it, Leviticus after that? And so Leviticus, if I'm remembering my books correctly, is I like want to double check that real quick. Leviticus, yeah, Leviticus, and Leviticus is about the like the priestly book, right, of how they're supposed to handle their stuff. Well, instead of saying Torah, yeah, I believe if you just go 7 characters, it will spell Yahweh, Yod He Wahe, and then if you go to Deuteronomy and Numbers, then it will spell Torah again on the 49 equal distances, but it will spell it backwards. So you basically have Torah spelt the direction pointing towards Yahweh at the 7 character distances in Leviticus. So that's pretty interesting. Those type of encodings, if you will, I think those seem to be pretty legit. They're like a basic checksum that sort of confirms the text. You don't need some fancy software, nothing goofy like that. It's not saying flat earth in English. It's saying things in the original Hebrew using, very specific numbers and stuff like that. So I feel a lot more comfortable with that kind of stuff. And anything beyond that, I'd start to be like, whoa, that's crazy. So anyway, yeah, we see here on this that the earth hangs upon nothing. So that seems to coincide with modern scientific theory. Move forward here. And thou shalt hang it upon for. So these are sort of just random cherry-picked verses that was based on a lot of the arguments I was seeing with the flat earth crowd and stuff. So it shall hang it upon 4 pillars of shittim wood overlaid with gold. Their hooks shall be of gold upon 4 sockets of silver. So right here we can see thou shalt hang it upon 4 pillars. So maybe that really is hanging as in dangling, but I didn't think about that. I was thinking that sounded more like it sets upon 4 pillars, but that's why I highlighted this one. I was just doing a search for pillars and that came up, so I thought there's a good example that, why in the last verse we saw the earth hangs upon nothing in space, and right here this other stuff hangs upon pillars. So if the earth was truly upon literal instead of figurative pillars, then that would be I would expect that we would see so. And in the book of Job as well, it says pillars. It talks about pillars like a verse over or so from wherever. So here's Job. This must be the one I'm talking about. Which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble. So this is good because in the same book that says that the earth hangs upon nothing, it's also talking about the earth being shaken out of her place and the pillars thereof tremble. So as you can see, whenever it's talking about the earth or heaven being on pillars, it's always talking about like shaking. And that's why it's using the term pillars figuratively there. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. So once again, there we go. And this is a thing where he's talking about like the mightiness of God, of Yahweh, and that's, so this is all figurative. This is just the old Hebrew way of saying the power of this person, and just, you know the pillars of heaven are tremble and are astonished. Like, do you think a pillar could really be astonished? Like, that's where we need to be careful about how literal we take it and selective we take things. It's like these are all describing just the power, just setting up like this model in your head and then like destroying it or shaking it with power. And right here, he bowed the heavens, also came down. So that's where one of those verses that the flat earthers like to pick. Natah, like I said, a primitive root to stretch or spread out, by implication to bend away. Not just to bend, but to bend away, including moral deflection. So, if you are turning away from your faith, maybe, or whatever, moral deflection, used in a great variety of applications. Afternoon, apply, bow, or bow. Even a bow, if you think about a person bowing, that term most likely came from them bowing themselves over, So there's a lot of, everything ties back to this ancient Hebrew, every language, literally. Bow, down, downing, carry aside, decline, deliver, extend, go, down, be gone, incline, intend, lay, whatever. It goes on, and I couldn't, there was a little bit more too, I couldn't fit and keep the verse here. So that's why I was kind of mentioning earlier that, there are all these little niche little uses of it possibly that could apply, where I could be wrong. But if you come up here to what should be, I don't think Strong's is 100% trustworthy, but kind of for the most part, kind of, you can see right here that by implication to bend away, that's more of the basic, a primitive root to stretch or spread out, like in its most basic primitive sense right there. And then these are the variety of applications down here. So, and then what is it of the earth? It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers. Apparently, I didn't click on circle for this definition. I described what that is, in all honesty. I think I covered ball in a minute. But sitteth was, I thought, you know what, because another flat earth argument, they pull up this verse and they say he sits on the circle of the earth or uses the earth as his footstool, things like that, that they're just, in my opinion, like I said 100 times, they're just taking it too darn literally. To sitteth, also, if you come in here, yashab, a primitive root properly to sit down, specifically as judge in ambush in quiet. So that word was just summed up, it's just, okay, we can just make it sound poetic or whatever by just saying sitteth, but instead of saying it is he that sits as a judge quietly upon the circle of the earth or something like that, So when you dig into the real meanings behind some of these words, they just wanted to get the translation done. There's a lot of people that just think the King James version was like, that everybody was like, took a bath in some anointing oil before they put the pen to paper, and then like, ran 12 miles and did 50 push-ups if they got one letter wrong or something. And it wasn't like that. It was like, of course I'm exaggerating when I say that, but people just think that it's like way too holy of a translation, in my opinion. And it was like playwright kind of people that translated it. Sorry about the noise if you can hear that. So these people, I mean, they were doing, I felt like, an earnest job and that type of a thing. I don't think they had cruel intentions. Maybe some people did. Maybe some people came in and said, hey, translate this one verse like that or something. That could have happened. I would be surprised. As a matter of fact, I think that did happen in a couple of places at least. But for the most part, I think these translators they were just getting the job done. Okay, and this one, so what happened was, here's the Bible verse. It's kind of confusing to see it, but right here in the middle is the Bible verse. Right here, and we're talking about this, he will surely violently turn and toss thee like a ball into a large country. So this ball, 1754, is right here, and then it's derived from 1752, which this reader application opened that window up here. So when I wanted to have them all on the screen at the same time, normally I'd just click through and it'd replace this screen with 1752, but I thought maybe if I long press it, so I long pressed it and it said open in a new window, and that's where it landed. So maybe that will explain. So if we start in the middle, go down, and then back up to the top, that's the ordering. Like a ball, 1754, which is Dalit. I don't. What would that be, like a wah or something right in the middle? A wah or none? Probably a wah, and then a resh. So it's basically like dwer. Um, a circle, ball, or pile, ball, turn, roundabout. So that's confirming like what I said earlier, where I said, right here, a circle or a ball. They happen to pick ball, which seems more appropriate with the way that they translated the rest of the verse. And to turn roundabout, that's another thing where I was talking about the action, like the ball turning, can very easily be referencing that just as much as a noun type of a ball. So if we go to what's derived from 1752 up here, same exact word, a primitive but a different numbering for some reason. Primitive root, properly to gyrate or move in a circle, that is to remain, to dwell. So like I was saying, that even if you think like, oh, it will, movement itself, the Bible right there's another scientific thing that the Bible backs, even in Old Testament times. Obviously, it's Hebrew, right? I believe this is from Isaiah. I could be wrong. But the fact that nothing is ever still, it's always moving. So right here it says to gyrate or to dwell, to move in a circle, to rotate or to orbit, that's very, anyway, I think you get the point. And then I just looked up like four winds. I did a search, and these were just the top search results. So I thought I'd just take a little screen clip of that. And it says, I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven and will scatter them towards all those winds. And there shall be no nation where the outcasts of Elam shall not come. So four winds seems to be a little more figurative. Of course, like I said, you lean toward, you initially get that literal impression in your head, for blowing winds, right? And then you move on to the figurative. And that's where sort of evidence that I looked into the Harper's Biblical Dictionary, looked up winds in there, and that's where it claims that, and it seems to be written by like one of the authors is sort of like an atheist. The other two are Bible believers. And this article seemed to be written by the atheist person, and they were describing it as the the blowing apart or bringing together, like some type of blowing, you're blowing in all directions basically, and you're either blowing all directions in or you're blowing all directions out. Then he said unto me, prophecy unto the wind, prophecy, son of man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain that they may live. Daniel spake and said, I saw my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. So especially when they're related to heaven, which most times they are, when talking about all four winds. Stretcheth south the north over the empty place and hangeth the earth upon nothing. So I think I've covered, I guess, all of my screen clips here. This was one of those videos on YouTube. And, back in the day I used to say like, oh, YouTube's not research. But it is if you think about it. I mean, if you automatically think everything you see on the internet or especially YouTube's right, that's not cool. But it's a source, just whether you want to consider it anecdotal or whatever, but it's a source. And right here, I'm not using it as a source of like something I consider to be factual information. I'm using it as a source for research or just what somebody's own anecdotal evidence is, which I'm countering. And it says, it's bringing up Isaiah. It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth. And they were comparing these two lines from Isaiah, saying, toss thee like a ball. Like, oh, if they wanted to, they could have said ball instead of the circle of the earth. I showed what sitteth expands to. I showed that ball and circle could be used almost interchangeably. And of course this is the English translation, so but I do believe this circle right here is a different Hebrew word than ball. I can't remember exactly, but so that in keeping that accuracy there. And then as far as like modern day science, things that we can do, the simple little tests that we can do to prove the flatness or lack thereof is, let's see here, if I select this, and if we think of Polaris, the North Star, I'm going to go ahead and rotate this right by 90. Okay, so Polaris is this white. If this was the North Pole up here, then Polaris is directly above the North Pole, right? So, and it never moves. I mean, if you get the right angle of alignment when you take a picture of Polaris, if you take a time lapse picture, it will stay centered. I mean, virtually exactly standard, while all the other stars will look like they're spinning around it, right? So it's a trip. It's good ways out, however many light years out in space, supposedly, and it stays, our North Pole always points right towards it. Such a trip. But anyway, a lot of the flat earthers will claim that, well, anyway, the more scientific argument would be that if you are right under Polaris, standing at the North Pole, then it's a 90 between the horizon, which I'll do like a line across here for like a horizon type of a line. Sorry, the line's a little jagged. But anyway, it's a 90-degree between Polaris and there. That's a 90-degree angle. If you were standing right there, at the North Pole, in front of you would be this horizon line where the sun may or may not set at, like depending on which east or west or whatever direction you're facing. But yeah, that and what time of year, a lot of factors on that of what type of a sunset action you'd get there. But anyway, right above your head at a 90-degree angle, which is denoted by a little square box, is Polaris, right? So that's how you can determine your latitude line of where you are on the Earth. Now, if I get rid of this and say that we're standing over here, like right there, and then we have a horizon line that's more like, well, maybe that's too extreme for the moment. So we'll say we're standing like right here. And then our horizon line would be like something more like this, right? Like the horizon line is basically the ground line, the line of the ground. So it's like this. Then you can see that angle from you to Polaris is no longer that 90-degree square because you're not right under it. You have this angle right here. And whatever this little curve is in there, you measure that, and that tells you how many degrees your angle is. And then you're able, that's what actually gives you your latitude degrees line. So the round Earth argument is that if you come way over here and you're standing right here, the flat earthers try and say, oh, that's just because, it's fixed up in the dome of the sky, and, wherever you're at, you see it from whatever degree angle. But what they neglect to mention is that if you're over here and you come more of like, that's not even fair. Like, it's really like something like that, I feel like. Okay, so if you're standing right here, you're not going to see Polaris. Well, technically Polaris is way up there. This is a bad example because it puts it really close to the Earth, but I think it illustrates the point. But if you picture, once you get past the equator into the southern hemisphere, you can't see Polaris anymore because of this effect that I'm illustrating right here in a pseudoscience-y sort of perspective, right? But just do it for yourself, don't let me do all your homework. And that's the thing with a lot of flat earth believers, is they don't take the time to really do their own homework. I know some of them do, but a lot of them are sort of programmed into the paradox. And it's understandable, because really it's a good gauge of whether or not you're doing enough research on your own in general. If you cannot disprove the flat earth to yourself, then you need to go to a better variety of sources. The most bizarre thing during my research was the lack of good arguments from the so-called objective science, round earth, spherical earth people, the flat earth deniers, if you will. Those people had the worst argument, the flat earther, and I was like, wow. So one of the things I started to realize, just thinking about what was going on in my own head as I was watching this stuff, was I had a tendency to want to start to believe the flat earth theory and the flat earthers, because they did have good arguments. They presented their arguments fairly well, things like that, and the round earth people were just saying it's a consensus of science. They were so lazy. It was like, did you not, even on things that were prepared debates and stuff, and they didn't even have a good rebuttal. And a lot of them said they don't even want to hear the argument of the other side, oftentimes, the flat earth denier people. And I thought, how dumb. Why wouldn't you want it? Any good scientist should be willing to hear, even if it's a completely crazy argument on the other side. They should hear it, And for one thing, you'll start realizing, hey, these people aren't just necessarily, not all of them are just trying to confirm some religious belief and refusing science. They're not science deniers. They're just going by science, and the only argument with any substance that they feel like they're getting, in my opinion, is from the flat earth side. So that made me wonder, like, there's been things like so-called false flag events or whatever, those types of things that have happened throughout history, right? And even with the Sandy Hook thing, dare I say it, I'm just saying that the first people I ever saw to claim that there might be some conspiracy behind Sandy Hook was the mainstream media news. And that right there, when they said that, that made me shut down and be like, I don't trust the mainstream news. No way. Maybe they do get some stuff right, but I am never trusting the mainstream news without fact checking them, period. Because half or more of the times it's complete BS. It's just, that's been my experience. And so when I saw them, they just seeded the idea of it being a conspiracy theory, and then people like Alex Jones ran off with it. And he didn't realize they just handed you a red herring. Why don't you smell your hands, buddy? You know what I mean? And so that led to that type of a thing. And that's the same thing I saw with this flat earth stuff in, 2014 and stuff, when it started getting presented to where people started finding out about it, and it started bubbling over, the information about it. When I started looking into it, I was able to tell just by the people, the media, just by watching YouTube videos of the people and the media, and just the way that it was presented. By media, I mean like Medium, the way the videos were composited, just different things, because at that time I sort of was caught up in some of the hypey videos at the time, and just like feeling like I was getting sucked into stuff that was like sensationalist. And so I had a pretty good idea of like what sensationalist videos look like, whether or not they were true or not, just the format of what these grassroots sensationalists, what their videos look like. And the flat earth stuff, for lack of better terms on all these terms, just wasn't fitting that mold. It was trying to kind of act like it was one of those videos, but these people were just straight dorky CIA or whatever kind of people, for lack of a better term, that I was just like, they're not being good actors. I can tell they're acting, even after a lifetime of watching movies and blocking out the fact that people are acting and going through that whole thing subconsciously. Because when I was a small kid, I don't know that it was the same for everybody, but I couldn't watch a movie twice. I can now, but I couldn't watch a movie twice and I could always tell when people were acting. I could just tell that it wasn't real. But then as I got older, it was like you have to kind of buy the lie to be entertained by it. And then I think outside of movies and stuff, that kind of stuff has a tendency to get, those psychological tactics have a tendency to get used against us. So anyway, with Polaris and that whole thing, you should be able to determine with that alone. And then the other easy thing to do is, of course, the ship rolling off the horizon. And you can look into things like I know there's arguments to be made that it's a heat effect or a chemical effect, things like that, which, whatever, maybe it is, but you need to have what heat effect, you know what I mean? Like, what type of thing is causing this, if that's the case, to make it completely disappear. But on the other hand, there is a very definite heat effect, a mirage-like heat effect that can happen around Chicago, where sometimes you can see the tops of the buildings that you shouldn't be able to see off in the distance. But if you notice, the bottom of those buildings are still cut off. You can never see the bottoms of them. And the tops are stretched. Like, you can tell if you compare it to an actual scale model of the building, you can see that it is a heat effect, and that, pieces of the building are disproportionately stretched. And that's, of course, why you're even seeing them at such a distance. And it looks like you're seeing a lot of the building, most of it maybe, or half of it at least. But if you compare it, you're really only seeing maybe like the top third of it, and even that is exaggerated and stuff. So there's a lot of things that those little pieces are left out by a lot of people. Whatever. I'm open to hear any argument. If there's a comment section below this video or around it, or you know how to get a hold of me or anything like that, then get a hold of me. And if you have some sort of counter argument, I'm not going to hate you for it. I'm not going to bag on you necessarily. Sometimes I will like get a little bit of a drip of emotion in there and be like, whatever. Especially with like the Q stuff that's going on, that QAnon stuff. I've been trying to tame it down, but I'm disgusted by it, because I know that it's a psyop, just like this flat earth stuff. And the last thing with the flat earth that reminds me is that, look at the UN logo. That's a flat earth logo. If you start looking at who believes the flat earth, it's not from the Bible originally. It's from these pagan groups that believe in a flat earth. So they're basically pushing their ideology on the Bible believers, which, if you look at the Bible and churches and stuff, they are the target of that. They are constantly trying to mix other religions and mythologies and stuff in with the Bible. Like I said earlier, Hades has nothing to do with the Bible, even though Strong's even mentions that as a synonym for hell. That is not true. That, of course, loosely has been applied, but Hades isn't even a location. It's an entity. It's a person figure, It's like, it's the kind of like the Grim Reaper, I guess, or something. It's like it's not, you know what I mean? That's how construed it is that when people say Hades, they're like that far off with it. And you could think like, oh, whatever, it's harmless, but it's not, because then you're implying this underworld where people are continually tortured, which does not fit the biblical narrative. But anyway, I could literally go on all day about this stuff. Thanks for watching.